Hello and welcome back to another full step-by-step PC build guide, and today I'm going to be showing you how to build a PC in the Shadowbase 800 FX from BQuiet. So the FX version is the top version of the case. We've got RGB on the front of the case and also four 140mm light wings fans included. There's the DX version of the case, which is RGB in the front but no RGB in the fans, and there's also a standard version of the case without any RGB. If you do get the other versions, the build process should be fairly similar, so you should be able to follow along to this guide. Okay, let's take a look at the other parts I'm going to be building with today. For the motherboard, I'm going to be using the ASUS ROG STRIX Z790 eGaming Wi-Fi 2. For the CPU, I'm going to be using Intel's new 14th Gen i9, the 14900K. Keeping our CPU cool, I've got a 360mm IO from ASUS. It's the ROG RYUJIN 3 360 ARGB. For RAM, I've got 32GB of DDR5 from ADATA. It's their XPG Lancer Blade at 6000 megatransfers per second. For storage, I'm going to be going with two M.2 drives for this build. The first is from ADATA and it's their brand new Gen 5 Legend 970 in 1TB capacity. For additional storage, I'm also going to be installing a Gen 4 drive from Lexar and it's their NM790 in 2TB capacity. Powering the whole build, I've got a 1200 watt fully modular platinum power supply from Thermaltake. It's their Tough Power PF3. And finally, for the graphics card, I'm going to be using the ASUS ROG Strix RTX 4080. Okay, that's all the parts. Let's get building. So as usual, I'm going to make a start by preparing our case. So to remove our tempered glass side panel, we've got two captive thumb screws at the back, which we need to loosen. And once they've been loosened, we can pull the panel backwards, lift it out and away. Our other side panel is removed in exactly the same way. Two captive thumb screws at the back to loosen, then pull the panel backwards and lift out and away. Taking a look at the back of the panel we've just removed, it's good to see we've got noise damping material on the back of it. Taking a look at our front I/O, we've got a power button, a single USB Type-C and two USB Type-A ports. We've got separate headphone and microphone jacks, and we've got a button to control the lighting effects on the case's built-in ARGB controller. On the top of the case, we've got a magnetically attached dust filter which can simply be lifted off. Taking a look at our case's front panel, we've got mesh on the front and also on the side of the front panel, and we've got an ARGB lighting bar on either side of the front of the case. To remove our front panel, we simply need to pull it off from the bottom. And if we take a look at the front panel we've just removed, you'll notice we've got these gold pins here and gold connectors here, which is how the front panel is able to have ARGB on it, but be able to connect wirelessly. So it's great to see we've got a dust filter behind the front panel. To remove it is simply a matter of opening the door up and then lifting the panel away. So you can see we've got three 140mm light wings PWM fans installed at the front of the case, and these are really good looking, high performing fans, so it's great to see BQuiet including them in this version of the case. If you prefer at the front, you can mount up to a 420mm radiator, but more standard sizes like 360 and 280 will also fit. It's exactly the same story at the top of the case. You can fit up to three 140 or three 120mm fans or up to a 420mm radiator. At the rear of the case, we've got another 140mm PWM light wings fan pre-installed, but if you prefer at the rear of the case, it is also possible to mount a 120mm fan or radiator. There's one more fan mounting location down at the bottom of the case, and you can see we've got holes here for 140 or 120mm fans. So it'd simply be a matter of setting your fan in down at the bottom, and this is a 140mm fan, and you need to remove the dust filter from the bottom of the case. And then it would just be a simple matter of screwing the fan in from the bottom using standard fan screws. And to allow the air coming from the fan at the bottom to get up towards your GPU and your CPU cooler, we've got these vented panels which are going to direct the airflow in this direction. If you prefer, this panel is removable and it's just a simple matter of pulling it out. So you can see at the rear of the case we've got our case accessory box, so we'll go ahead and remove that and give you a look at what's inside it. So this is what comes in our case accessory box. So we've got plenty of cable ties, we've got our screws individually packaged, we've got a few loose screws, we've got a standoff insertion and removal tool, we've got some rubber grommets for mounting either hard drives or SSDs, and we've got our hard drive bracket. I'll show you how to use this later on. In terms of motherboard support, the case supports motherboards up to AITX in size, and you want to go with a CPR cooler, the maximum height supported is 180mm. We've got a really nice cable cover bracket over to the right hand side of the motherboard, and if you do decide to go with a larger AITX motherboard, you might want to move this bracket further towards the front of the case. So there's a screw on the rear of the case that holds the bracket on, we're going to need to remove. And then we can just push down on the clip at the top of the bracket, which is going to free the bracket up. And you'll notice that we've got two sets of holes down here at the bottom, so all we're going to need to do is move the bracket over to the holes further towards the front and then push the bracket back into place, and it's going to clip in at the top, and all we need to do is secure it is fasten the screw at the back again. This is obviously going to give you more space for a larger motherboard, but because I'm going with a standard ATX motherboard, I'm going to put it back to its default position. So you can see at the rear of the case, we've got 7 horizontal PCI expansion slot brackets, and you're going to be able to fit really large graphics cards in this case, up to a maximum length of 430 millimeters. And you can see the case is really wide, so we've got absolutely loads of space in front of the graphics cards for plugging your cables in. If you do prefer to mount your graphics card in the vertical position, this bracket is rotatable. So we've just got these 5 screws to remove. And you'll notice just as removing the screws, the bracket is actually fallen out. We need to get this little panel out by lifting it out from here. We're then going to be able to take this bracket and just simply turn it round. There's little notches here and here we're able to slot it into. And then again, you'll notice there's 2 notches here, so we can take this little panel and slot it into place on top. And then it's just a matter of replacing the screws. And this is what the bracket looks like in the vertical position. And one of the nice things about this is you can pick and choose which of the slots you put your GPU in. So you're going to be able to make sure it's well away from the tempered glass side panel. Now, one important thing to point out that the riser cable that you're going to need to install your graphics card in the vertical position isn't included with the case, but BQuat do offer one as an optional extra. So one other thing to point out is we don't have any rubber grommets anywhere in the case, but what we do have is this really long cutout at the bottom of your motherboard. So you're going to bring your cables through exactly where they need to go and get them plugged in at the bottom. We've got this nice cable cover bracket, which should hopefully hide the cables coming into the side of the case. And again, at the top, we've got a really long cutout here at the top of the motherboard for bringing your cables through, and some additional cutouts here for your EPS cables, and another one at the rear for your fan cables. So moving through to our case's rear compartment, it's nice to see our cables are nicely organised with Velcro cable straps, and as well as this, we've also got plenty of cable tie-down points. In terms of cable routing space, this looks to be really good. So this is our case's built-in PWM fan and ARGB hub, and our 4 pre-installed case fans are already connected up to it. And you can see we've got 4 additional ports for both PWM and ARGB. So it's good to see we're going to have motherboard control for both fan speed and ARGB if we plug these 2 cables into our motherboard. But importantly, don't forget to plug the SATA cable into your power supply, or this hub isn't going to work. So in terms of drive mounting locations, on this bracket here, we're going to be able to mount either a 3.5 inch or 2.5 inch drive. If you get the version of the case that doesn't have the built-in fan or ARGB controller, you're going to be able to mount another 2.5 inch or 3.5 inch drive where it goes. To install a 3.5 inch drive, all you're going to want to do is take the little rubber grommets and the larger 3.5 inch drive screws and screw them into the 4 holes on the back of your hard drive. Then you're just going to want to line the hard drive up with these holes here, and then just pull down and your drive is going to lock into place, and that is actually nice and secure there. If you want to go with a 2.5 inch drive, it's these inner holes that you're going to want to use, and you want to just simply push the rubber grommets through the holes in the bracket. And then into the back of your SSD, you're simply going to screw the little pegs that come in the case accessory box. And then all you need to do is line your SSD up with the rubber grommets and then push them into the holes on the grommets. And that's then going to hold your SSD in place. So it is possible to move this bracket further down on the case. All you would simply need to do is loosen the thumb screw. If we didn't have our ARGB hub here, the bracket would simply pull out, and there's 2 little notches on this side where it's held in. You would take the bracket down here, there's 2 notches here, you would slot it into place, pull it back in, and you've got this hole here to secure the thumb screw. We've got another drive bracket towards the front of the case, and on this bracket we're going to be able to mount 2 2.5 inch drives in the main body of the case. So there's a thumb screw at the top on the bracket we need to remove, and then the bracket can be tilted out and lifted away. Then we can set up to 2 2.5 inch drives onto the front of the bracket, and what we're going to do is secure each of the drives in at the back with 4 of the SSD screws. We can then slot our bracket back into place and secure it at the top with a thumb screw. And you'll notice then we've got a little cutout here, which is going to allow us to plug in the cables to our SSDs. And then this is what it's going to look like at the front of the case with 2 SSDs installed. And you can see the cables coming from them are going to be nicely hid by this little plate in the middle. And I think normally I don't install 2.5-inch drives in the build, but in terms of aesthetics, because I am planning on going for a black and white build, I think it might actually work very well. So I think I'll actually leave these in today. So it is possible to install a hard drive bracket at the front of the case. You notice we've got these holes at the top and also holes at the bottom for securing it. So we can set our bracket up into place. Now this bit here needs to go under these notches, so we'll tilt it into place and then line it up. And there's 3 different positions we can install the bracket in depending on how far we want the hard drive cage towards the front of the case. So this is it installed in the front position, and it would be these holes here and these holes here you'd secure it into. If we just move it down a little bit, there we go, that's it into its middle position, and we'll be securing it in through these 2 holes in the middle and again down at the bottom. And it is also possible to install it all the way towards the back. There we go here, and this would make additional space at the front if you were going with maybe a large radiator at the front of the case. So what we can do is I'll move it to the front, because I think if I was installing it, this is where I would want to have it to give me the most space for my power supply. And then we'll secure it into place with 4 screws. So these were the loose screws that came in the bag. Now either I've lost one of them or my case only came with 3. I'll have to look back at the video and see. But there should be an additional one to go in here. So unfortunately out of the box, you're not actually going to be able to use this hard drive cage unless you pick up one of these additional hard drive brackets that BeQuiet offer as an optional extra. With one of these brackets, you can either mount a 2.5-inch or 3.5-inch drive in the drive cage. And to do so, it's just a simple matter of slotting the bracket into the drive cage and then using the thumb screw here to put the bracket in place. And you can see you're going to be able to install another one up above as well. Now the only downside to doing this is it is going to interfere with the space for your power supply, although there's absolutely loads of room for installing your power supply over here, so I don't think you're going to get into trouble with that. But the main issue would be if you wanted to install that fan down at the bottom of the case, you're not going to be able to do that with a hard drive cage installed. Again, BeQuiet have got you covered in terms of radiators at the front of the case. It is possible to move this bracket all the way over here, where you should have plenty of room for a really thick radiator at the front. So our power supply is going to go down at the bottom. The case is compatible with full-sized ATX power supplies up to a maximum length of 250mm. Although with the hard drive cage removed and no fan installed at the bottom, you've got absolutely loads of room for your power supply and associated cables. It's also really nice to see that our case comes with a removable power supply bracket. It's held on with 4 thumb screws. So we're going to be able to attach this bracket to the back of our power supply, and then we're going to be able to install the power supply straight in from the back of the case, again securing it with the thumb screws, which is definitely an easier way of installing our power supply. We're now ready to start working on the motherboard. We're going to be installing the CPU, the backplate for our CPU cooler, our M.2 SSDs and our RAM before we put the motherboard into the case. To open the socket cover, we're going to need to push this lever down and out, bring it all the way to the top of the motherboard, and then we're going to be able to open the socket cover up. We can then take our CPU, lining it up with the socket, making sure the text is the correct way up, and drop it into place. Once we're happy everything's in the right place in the socket, we can close the socket cover down, and if we apply a little bit of pressure here, the black bit of plastic will pop off, and we'll put that in the motherboard box for safekeeping. Then we can close the lever to secure our CPU in the socket. So our motherboard has 5 M.2 slots. This one with the really beefy heatsink at the top is our Gen 5 slot. So this is the one we're going to want to install our Gen 5 drive in. The bottom 4 slots are Gen 4 slots. The CPU lanes for the slot at the bottom left of the motherboard come from the CPU, while the other 3 slots, they come from the chipset. So this is the one we're going to want to install our Gen 4 drive in. And you'll notice we've got some plastic protection on the Gen 5 slot, which we need to remove. So we can then go ahead and set our drive into the slot. And we go ahead and flatten it down. We've got this little Q latch here that we can close to secure the drive into place. Now the only slight issue we're running into here is because the drive is in its own little enclosure, it is quite thick at the bottom. And with the heat pad on, it's not actually closing. So I might try removing the heat pad and installing it again. Okay, so with the heat pad removed, we can try it again. So we'll line our drive up with a slot, push it into place and flatten it down. And then we'll go ahead and close the Q latch to hold the drive in place. Now you'll notice we've got some wires running from our drive, and that's because it does have a fan inside it designed to cool our drive down. So I think actually to keep the cable out of the way, I'm just going to route it down here. And then if we pass it through to the back on this side of the motherboard, hopefully you won't be able to see it. And then we can install our Gen 4 drive down at the bottom of the motherboard, flatten the drive down, and then we'll go ahead and close our Q latch to secure it in place. If you're using the motherboard from new, you'll have some plastic protection on the back of the heatsink to remove. As you can see, I've used this one before, and then we can replace our heatsink. We're going to be installing a RAM in the 2nd and 4th slot along from the CPU, so we can go ahead and open the clips on these slots. Then we can go ahead and line our RAM up with the slot. Once we're happy everything's lined up, it's just some firm pressure to the RAM, and it's going to clip into place. Then we can take our second stick and install it in exactly the same way, line it up with the slot, and once we're happy it's lined up, some firm pressure, and it will clip into place. Next we need to install the backplate for our CPU cooler. Because we've got an LGA 1700 motherboard, we're going to want to have all these pins pulled to their outer setting. You can see our motherboard has both LGA 1700 and LGA 1200 holes, but we will get better cooling using the LGA 1700 holes. So I've got all these pulled to the outer setting, and all we need to do then is lower it down through the holes in the motherboard, and the backplate will just fall into place. So just move this one slightly. There we go. And then we've got one of these standoffs to go onto each corner. Next we can set our motherboard into the case, line it up with the standoffs at the back, and I'm just going to make sure the SATA cable from our SSD goes through to the back. So you'll see this middle standoff is elongated and it goes through the motherboard, help holding it in place. So we're not actually going to put a screw into it, and then we're going to use 8 of the larger screws in the case accessory bag to screw the motherboard to the case. Okay, next thing to do is get our case cables plugged in. Our HD audio cable is going to go to this header down the bottom left hand side of the motherboard. So we can go ahead and bring the cable through the cutout, and we're going to need to plug it in with the HD audio text facing up the way. We've got 2 ARGB headers down the bottom of the motherboard, so we can plug the ARGB cable coming from our hub into one of these headers. Next to that, we've got a system fan header, so we'll bring our PWM cable coming from our hub through, line it up and push into place. Our front panel connectors are going to go into this header down the bottom right hand side of the motherboard, and it's the pins towards the left hand side of the header that we're going to want to plug in. BQuad have been really kind and combined everything into a single cable to plug in, so we're going to want to plug it in with the front panel text facing up the way. We've got our USB 3.0 header here, so we'll bring our cable through the cutout, line it up with the header and push into place. And just above that we've got our front panel type C header, so we'll bring the cable through the cutout, line it up with the header and push into place, and again just put all the excess cable through to the back. Also, because I've left in the SATA SSDs, we're going to need to plug in our SATA data cables. So I'm just going to pass the cable through the cutout, line it up with the SATA ports and push into place. And then I'm just going to bring another cable through in front. We'll go ahead and line it up with the port and push into place. We're now ready to install our power supply, and our power supply is fully modular, coming out any of the cables plugged in. I've gone ahead and plugged in the cables that we're going to need. So I plugged in 2 8-pin EPS cables to provide additional power to our CPU, our 12-volt high power cable to power our graphics card, our 24-pin ATX power cable, and I plugged in 2 SATA power cables. We're going to need SATA power for both our case and our SSD, and also our 2 SATA drives are going to need power, and they're going to be in slightly different locations, which is the reason I've gone with 2 cables. Next we need to fix the bracket from our case onto the back of our power supply and secure it in place with 4 of the same screws we used to secure the motherboard to the case. Last thing to mention is our power supply has a smart zero fan mode. It's currently turned on, which is just the way I want it. It means when our power supply is working under low load states, the fan will stop spinning, reducing noise in the build. So this is our power supply's intake fan, and we're going to want to install it facing down the way where it can get cool air from underneath the case. So it's just a matter of pulling all the cables through into the case, and then we'll slide the power supply into place at the bottom, and then we can tighten up with 4 thumb screws. Our 2 8-pin EPS cables are going to go into these headers at the top of the motherboard. So we can bring them through this cutout here, line them up with a header and push into place. And then we'll just bring our second cable through as well, line it up with a header, push into place, and then we'll just flatten the cables down. Our 24-pin cable is going to go into this header here, so we'll bring it through the cutout, line it up with the motherboard, and push into place. And again, just pull all the excess cable through to the back. Then we need to power our SATA drive, so we're going to take the connector coming from one of the cables and plug it into the bottom SATA drive and also into the top SATA drive. We're also going to need to plug our SATA data cables in, and these were the cables that we plugged into the motherboard earlier on. So it's just a matter of lining them up with the SSD, and then we'll push into place. And then same thing on the bottom connector. Next we need to install our fans on the radiator. And if you look at the fans, you'll notice we have little gold connectors on them, and they're going to connect magnetically. So on one end we're going to have male connectors, and on the other end it's female connectors. So we're going to have to line them up male to female. So the fans are going to connect magnetically. So I've got the connectors around the right way, and all we need to do is join them up, and they're magnetically going to attach together. And then our third fan, and it's simply going to clip into place. We also get two different connectors. One is male and one is female, and there's gold connectors on either end of the fan, so it depends where you want to connect it. So I'm going to connect it on this end here, so we've got all the cables coming out at the same place. So we've got male connectors here, so I'm going to use the one that has the female connectors on the other end. And then again, it's just a matter of lining the cables up magnetically, and it should just clip into place. And then we can go ahead and set our fans onto the radiator. And then we'll secure the fans into place using 12 of the long radiator screws. So just before we mount the I/O in the case, this screen is magnetically attached, and it simply lifts off, which is going to make installing it in the case a little bit easier. We can then insert our I/O into place at the top of the case, and we're going to screw it into place at the top with 12 of the shorter radiator screws. And we can then replace our case's top dust filter. So one thing I'm just noticing, I've decided on the wrong end to plug the cable into. This is coming out at the front of the case, so I'm just going to pull this one off, and then I'm going to pass our other connector on at this side and just pass the cables through to the back. I just think our fan cables on here where there's a big gap are definitely going to be much more noticeable, given that I have centered our I/O towards the rear of the case. Okay, so I've brought the cable through to the main body of the case, and coming from it we've got two cables, a 4-pin PWM cable and a 3-pin 5V ARGB cable. So the 4-pin PWM cable we're going to want to plug into our CPU fan header, which is this header at the top in the middle of the motherboard. And we've also got an ARGB header at the top of the case here. And then I'm just going to pull the excess cable coming from both of these cables through to the back. Okay, next thing to do is to add some thermal paste to the center of the CPU. If you're using the I/O from new and there's thermal paste pre-applied to the cold plate, you can skip this step. So just before we line the I/O up with the CPU, what I like to do is twist the cable up behind the bracket, so the bracket is actually going to help organize the cable. So I'm going to bring this cable up, but I'm also going to bring the cable coming from the magnetic screen and just pass it round the bracket too. And then I'm going to go ahead and line the bracket up with the back plate beneath. And then we're just going to get one of the plain thumb screws, the one without the little groove in it that comes with the I/O. Okay, so that's all 4 thumb screws on loosely. First of all, I'm just going to double check the cables aren't anywhere near the cold plate, which they're not. And then we can go ahead and tighten up each corner in turn. Now I'm just going to pull the USB cable coming from the screen up, and then we can set the screen into place. I'm just going to pass the USB cable through to the back. We've got two USB 2.0 headers down the bottom of the motherboard, so I'm just going to bring our cable through, line it up with the header, and push into place. And then beside our CPU fan header at the top, we've got our CPU pump header, so we'll go ahead and plug the cable coming from the pump into it. And then we'll just tuck the excess cable up to the top. And hopefully you'll see now why I routed the cables around the bracket, because it just looks really clean coming out from the pump here with all the cables tucked in out of the way. We're now ready to install our graphics card, so we're going to need to remove the second and third slot cover down from the top. And then we can go ahead and line our GPU up with a slot. And once we're happy our GPU is lined up, it's just some firm pressure to get it to clip into place. And then we'll secure the GPU into place with the 2 thumb screws we've just removed. Then we can bring our 12V type power cable through the cutout at the bottom, line it up with our GPU, and push into place, and then we'll just tuck the excess cable through to the back. Okay, last thing to do is some cable management to get the panels back on again. Okay, so that's the build complete. If you don't know how to install Windows, the drivers, set up the RGB software, enter the BIOS, update the BIOS, and adjust all the BIOS settings, I've made a separate video and I'll put a link to that video in the description. Taking a look at our temperatures, our i9 14900K idled at 34 degrees and reached a maximum of 102 degrees during a 10-minute AIDA64 stability test. During that test, there was up to 29% thermal throttling. Our RTX 4080 idled at 29 degrees and reached a maximum of 62 degrees during the stability test. We had an average noise level of 36 decibels at idle and 51 decibels under load. So in terms of those temperatures, the GPU temperatures seem to be pretty good. The fans at the front are certainly getting enough airflow in. The CPU temperatures may sound high, but this 14900K just seems to run really hot during an AIDA64 stability test. Obviously during gaming or other simple tasks using the PC, it will never get to those levels. And I did a build recently where I had a 360mm IO set to intake in a push-pull configuration, and even with that it was still thermal throttling. So in terms of the temperature in this case, I'm pretty happy with them in terms of the hardware that I'm using. In terms of the noise levels, it is important to say that all the noise levels were recorded with the SATA cable coming from our Gen 5 NVMe drive unplugged, because when it was plugged in, the noise was incredibly loud all of the time. I did test out our Gen 5 drive both with and without the SATA cable going to the fan plugged in. In terms of the performance, there wasn't any significant difference, and we were getting just under the 10,000 gigabytes per second maximum speed. The maximum temperature recorded on our ADATA Legend Gen 5 drive during the benchmark was 72 degrees with the fan unplugged, which was 10 degrees hotter than when the fan was plugged in. So personally, if I was going to be using this drive, given that it performed fairly well without the fan plugged in, I would simply remove it from the heatsink, although this will invalidate the warranty of the drive, and I would just use it with the standard motherboard heatsinks. And I have done some Gen 5 testing with Crucial's drive, and I've compared it with the heatsinks and plugging it into the motherboard, and compared some of the real world performance you get from Gen 5 versus Gen 4. So if you're interested in that, I'm not going to repeat it today, but I'll put a link to that video in the description so you can go ahead and check it out. In terms of a case review, this case has now been out a couple of months. I was quite late getting started with it, so I'm not planning on doing a separate review. I will share my thoughts on it briefly with you now. In terms of the temperatures, the noise levels, these are all pretty good, and I think that's largely due to the light wings fans that BeQuiet have installed. They look good, they run quiet, and they perform well. And I think a large part of what you're actually paying for this case, when you factor how much these fans cost, is going towards the cost of the fans included. In terms of the case itself, it's a good looking case. The build quality is good. It's obviously not as high as the new dark base case from BeQuiet. There's certainly features missing, like the removable fan brackets, the fan hubs on the brackets, the phone charger on the top, and the more fancy fan control and ARGB control you've got on the front of this case. But this is a rock solid case. It looks well and it has a good build quality. I really only had a couple of issues with it. The first was I did think a GPU support bracket would be useful. Given that it made all the space for these large GPUs, I do think having a GPU support bracket over on that cable cover bracket would have been fairly simple to add in. My other big issue was with that cable cover bracket. I really did not like the position of it, and it seemed far too far towards the front of the case. The actual position it's in now probably would have been perfect for a new ATX motherboard rather than the ATX motherboard that it is designed for. And I personally think that bracket should have been much closer to the motherboard because it isn't really serving its function where it is. So hopefully you have enjoyed this full step-by-step PC build guide. If you have, please remember to give it a thumbs up. And if you're not currently subscribed to the channel, please hit the subscribe button as well. Thanks for watching.